Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad to welcome back to the show Eugene Puryear, who's an American journalist, author, activist, politician, and host on Breakthrough News. He's also the author of Shackled and Chained, Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America. Eugene, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me back. Great to be here.
Absolutely. And Eugene, we had you back on the show in October to talk about what's happening in Congo. And I definitely recommend that folks check that out, especially if you want more backstory on the issues that place the Congo as a battleground for immensely rich natural resources internally via Rwanda and, of course, so-called Western powers like France and the US. And one might call it an epicenter of green imperialism. So, Eugene, I want to start with April of this year when Congolese President Tshisekedi met with French President Macron to discuss quote unquote mineral mapping, which to me just takes me back to the Berlin conference, like the mapping of the cutting up of Africa. It feels very similar. He was also seeking investments from French companies in both agriculture and the energy sector. So could you talk to us a little bit about, the ownership, the current ownership of these mines? So who's responsible for this child and slave labor, and what investment from imperialist powers would do, and what would that mean?
Well, it's a great question. And I think pointing to the Berlin conference is a critical reference point, because what's happening in the Congo really is a scramble for resources and a scramble for wealth on multiple different sides. And the trip of Tshisekedi to France is a big piece of that. So, in the current moment, it's a bit of a mix in terms of the mines, in terms of the different minerals, but most of the sort of critical minerals in Congo are mines that are Chinese companies, usually partnered with Congolese companies. But then there's also a niche for a lot of, Swiss companies, quote unquote, but really it's sort of Swiss domiciled American, primarily American and European countries. And then also you have UAE is also involved in a significant way, especially in the issue of gold. And so one of the issues that has become a factor is that the Western countries have become very concerned that China has, in their words, a quote unquote stranglehold on critical minerals for the future, primarily cobalt, but also nickel, which are critical for the batteries essentially that are powering our everyday lives, but also copper, which is also mined in relationship with nickel and cobalt, which is a huge part of all the wires that we use. So really that the sort of the things that are powering our everyday life, if you will, are very not only concentrated in Congo, but that most of them are then mediated through China, right? So it goes from Congo through some other African countries to China, and then they're selling it to Apple and so on and so forth. And so the Western countries want to cut out the sort of Chinese middleman, so to speak, and they want their mining companies to be in a better position. And so France, following the United States, which has been doing quite a bit on this front, the United States is funding a new big mining project on the border of DRC and Zambia, which is actually where some of the worst abuses are taking place, some of the ones that no one really knows about. Some people think, and I think credibly so, there's actually modern day slavery happening in a lot of these areas because they're so remote, no one knows exactly what's happening. And this is the area the United States is trying to penetrate its companies and its capital into. Then they're also, along with France, and this is a part of this trip, building a railroad from sort of a very mineral rich region of Congo through Angola to the Atlantic Ocean, right? So to try to cut out, to make it easier for Western countries to get access to these minerals. So Tshisekedi going to France, and Macron, of course, giving him a big red carpet treatment, as it were, was very much tied into the desire of French companies to get into the game where the US companies are, where the Swiss companies are, where the Australian companies are, Australia, another big mining power, which is trying to essentially edge China out from this perspective. So to go back to the quick thing, and I'll end here, in terms of the agreements and the terrible state of artisanal mining, which is, people are being poisoned by mercury. There's all these mine collapses. People are being, completely hurt. There's no education for kids. There's clean water is being completely destroyed. And the amount of money they're making is like, it's so negligible. It's almost a joke to even talk about in terms of what they're making year to year. But to say all that, Another big piece of Tshisekedi's trip, and this has also been a big piece of what's been talked about for the past year in Congo, is this idea of investing in small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, of course, that sounds good to a lot of people, like small business, that's good. But what that actually means is they're expanding the realm of essentially subcontractors that are Congolese to cover for these various foreign companies. So they're going in and saying, give more money to this person and that person who is tied to the presidential administration to be a subcontractor on your project. So it won't really be Congolese control of Congolese minerals, but more of the wealth will be funneled to Congolese elites. And there are, very few rich people in Congo percentage-wise, but, numerically, over a significant number of millionaires that are coming from this sector. So they're trying to expand that sector. And these people are really the people who I think are the most responsible in some ways for the conditions on the ground, because since all they care about is money and all they care about is getting their contracts, whether you're coming from China, whether you're coming from America, whether you're coming from Europe, they're just like, whatever y'all want to do to get this out of here, do whatever you need to do as long as you pay us off. And the Congolese military and some of these various armed groups often support these efforts to make sure that these things are happening. And capitalism being what capitalism is, the bottom line rules everything. So if you can get the minerals out super cheaply, you're going to do it. So I think it's really a very important factor of what we saw in France, is that the elites of Congo are trying to get more from France in order to basically sell their own country for parts. And they're trying to play the different countries off against each other to get the maximum amount of money for themselves, while almost nothing trickles down to the average person who's mining or living in these regions, doing agriculture or the like.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for connecting those issues, because it reminds us that we can't talk about imperialism without capitalism, and vice versa as well. And I'm curious, I mean, you're talking about these mining regions, and of course, something that has pushed Congo to be discussed, not of course on corporate media, which we'll get to in a minute, but on alternative media sources, is the extreme violence that's happening there. And as I understand it, and as you pointed out, this is part of like this larger proxy war for these resources. And I also saw that earlier this year, the EU pledged 20 million euros to the Rwandan military to secure minerals for, quote, clean tech, and also a natural gas site for France. Just throw that in there as well. And at the same time, of course, you have politicians like Macron talking about peace solutions for East Congo. And at this meeting between President Tshisekedi and Macron, a representative for the Congolese president cited France's membership on the UN Security Council as, a positive thing. Oh, they're going to propose resolutions for the DRC. But as the organization Friends of Congo points out, the DRC has the largest UN presence in the world, UN forces, and there is reported evidence of mass violence by UN troops, which is also something that protesters were decrying last year at what became known as the Goma massacre, where Congolese troops killed 56 people who were protesting the presence of UN forces. So, I mean, it just seems like there are enemies on all sides. You've got the Rwandan military and militias. You've got the UN forces, who people are saying have done extreme acts of violence. And then you have Congolese forces firing on and killing the Congolese for protesting this violence. I mean, this is just, it seems like a morass of just violent forces all trying to take control of the Congo, and the Congolese people not having friends anywhere.
I think that's a very good point. And it really all dates back to 1997. I won't do all of the history, but just to give people a sense, you really had, and this is the longtime sort of, pro-Western, pro-imperialist dictator Mobutu Sese Seko. He falls in 97. And other than a very brief period, you essentially have had state collapse from then to now. And you've had this contest of various different forces in the eastern part of the Congo, especially trying to control territory, because controlling territory means controlling money. And so there's been all these various shifting sands over the years. You also now, by the way, have a Southern African Development Community group of troops that are in East Congo that are fighting the Rwandan-backed M23 rebels. Ironically enough, the Southern African troops are probably more popular in some cases than the Congolese troops, even though they're from other countries, because many people see South Africa and some of these other countries as having defended, and Zimbabwe and others having defended Congo against Rwanda, at different times Uganda over the past, but nonetheless, still very similar issues that you have here. But what it really all boils down to for the Congolese people is that they have been made essentially pawns by their own leaders and by leaders in other countries. And there hasn't ever really been a political process that has allowed them to weigh in any significant way. Now, of course, there's a lot of struggle on the ground that takes place. You mentioned the Goma massacre, people protesting. There's actually a lot of protest in Goma on a regular basis, but they're relatively small because there's a state of emergency. So you essentially could be arrested and other things like that. The artisanal miners, are continuing to try to come together, create cooperatives to protest, to do different things. But still, nonetheless, it's hard to find a political space because on the one hand, you have the Congolese government, which most Congolese want the Congolese government to have, whatever their critiques of the government, to have hegemony over the country. They don't want all these armed groups. They don't want other countries coming in from outside. So you have people who want the Congolese government to take action and to try to control the area and to bring stability. But then you also have all of these various different armed groups, some allied with the Congolese army, some allied with Rwanda, and they're fighting each other, for control of this territory. And ultimately, there's so many different mixed up issues that really exist in this context. There's not an ability to have for either side to really win out. And so you've had for decades now these sort of two general sides. You have sort of a government side and a Rwandan backed side, and a number of sort of armed actors with different motivations aligning with either side to sort of war over this area. But the thing that is clear is that on both sides, the main goal is to get control of the resources. And not even really to get control of the resources. That's actually not even the right way to look at it, but to become the interlocutor for the resources with the foreign powers of various sorts, right? So is Rwanda going to control the flow of these goods? Is Uganda going to control some of the flow of these goods? Is the Congolese elites going to control some of these goods? Are they going to try to find some way to collaborate with each other to come up with a plan where they can work together? But it's elites on both sides trying to exploit Congolese mineral resources. And so they both conspire to keep popular resistance from really rising in any significant way in the eastern part of the Congo, which makes it very, very difficult to change the political balance of forces. Although we're seeing some green shoots. I mean, in the last presidential election, you had an independent candidate, Denis Mukwege, who, it's rare that someone outside of the sort of political elite system can make any noise. And he was making a lot of criticisms of what's going on in the East. We've seen the Rwanda's killing campaign by the Congolese, which if you watch international sports or events, people doing this, and that image, which went around the world, which did so much to bring awareness to what was happening in the Congo. So we're seeing development of popular resistance, but it's difficult when you're sort of between a rock and a hard place here, where even the people who I think many Congolese hope win the fighting are in and of themselves not really having an agenda that's popular for the Congolese people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious because right now, especially with what's happening in Gaza, a lot of people are hoping that the UN does something. The ICJ will say this, or the UN Security Council might do something like that. And I want to temper that hope and that fervor for the UN with, what are the UN forces? Why is the DRC the home to the most UN forces? And what are they supposedly doing there with regards to the unrest and violence?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you said it because we do have to temper our hopes. And now the UN is actually withdrawing because it's become so unpopular. It's doing it very slowly. But the reason why it's the biggest force is because since 97 and really even a little bit before that, the knowledge of what's going on in Congo has prompted various countries to try to use the United Nations and the Security Council countries in particular as a regulating force. And that perhaps the United Nations, by stepping in, could create sort of like a buffer zone that could establish some level of stability or security that would facilitate the flow of minerals outside of the Congo. So they're there for the exact same reason every other armed force is there. It's just that it's really the agenda of sort of the big powers that are looking to find a way to make sure that this sort of resource extraction process can happen with the least amount of conflict possible and sort of stand in between the two sides. But nonetheless, it hasn't worked at all because it's not addressing any of the root causes of what's actually taking place in the Congo, and it's just asserting itself. And you have this weird mandate where, and listen, it's unclear. Some of these UN forces are profiteering. Some of them are committing various, crimes against the local communities. Oftentimes they're not even fighting some of these other forces, whether because they don't want to take losses. So it's not even like they were waging a super aggressive security campaign in the first place. But even to the extent they were, the cause of it, or the sort of reason for it, is certainly not a benign reason. It's just designed to create stability to help resource extraction. And so ultimately they ended up getting caught in the morass of all these various groups and all these various interests, and not being able to make a difference, and ultimately becoming complicit in all of it. And I think it's like a lot of these UN campaigns we've seen in Africa, same thing in Somalia in the early 1990s, where because there's not really addressing the root cause issue, same thing with Haiti, by the way, since you're not addressing the root cause issues, since you're not empowering the local populations and people to have a role in their own security, you're really just dropping more armed forces into a very volatile situation that cannot be resolved by force of arms. Like, these questions are not going to be resolved by force of arms. You have ethnic issues that date back to the Rwandan, what's known as the Rwandan genocide. I mean, that's a very, in and of itself, a controversial issue in how it's played out. But like, the context around that is a big factor in what's happening here. You have other ethnic issues that are also playing out that are happening here. You have the class-based issues of the poor farmers and miners and others who are looking to have a different dispensation of the economy vis-a-vis the elites. That's playing out here. And so all of these things are really political problems that can't be resolved just by war. And if they could, they would have been resolved by now. So throwing in the UN, throwing in, Southern African Development Community, throwing in whoever you're throwing in is unlikely to change the status quo issue in the eastern part of the Congo, because it's not addressing why you have these conflicts in the first place, and it's not addressing the social relations that would be required for real stability, which would be to not only have peace, but to have justice as well, in terms of those who are being forced into the mines or forced into subsistence agriculture.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I think it's important to recognize that the UN isn't just this egalitarian force for good that it sometimes is painted as. And I want to get to the media silence on this, because there's been some rightful indignation on social media and on alternative media outlets that, while understandably what's happening in Gaza takes up a lot of bandwidth, it doesn't mean that, I mean, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. There is space to discuss an importance of connecting these issues with regards to what's happening in Gaza or Sudan or Congo. And I was curious to hear your take on, why is corporate media so silent about this, even when they're willing at this point to give a little bit of room on things like Gaza. I mean, Rania Khalek, who works with Breakthrough News, was just on Piers Morgan. So that facade seems to be cracking, but the lying by omission vis-a-vis Congo is staying steadfast. Why do you think that is?
I think, from a US media perspective, Africa is seen as a non-story. I think most of the US sort of, I don't want to say the US population per se, but the way Africa has been presented to them, it's always like it's just a group of people fighting somewhere. Like, that's kind of the story of Africa. There's a lot of poverty in Africa, and it all kind of bleeds in and seems the same. So I think for a lot of mainstream US media, it basically is a story that it's good to cover occasionally if something major happens, like on May 3rd, when there was the bombing of the refugee camps in Goma by the M23 rebels. Okay, we'll do a story about that, or if something, some major issue, some UN report, but the sort of day in, day out reporting, I think that it's the sort of racism that exists in these outlets that make them not really think that this is something that would be saleable to their audience. I mean, I think there's some other factors that may be involved. I mean, I think that to some degree, it like anything, it's complex until you understand it. But I think there's also a factor that, like, to actually get into the depths of what's really going on, that's it's too big a story, it's too long a story. Who wants to listen to all that? So rather than try to break it down intelligibly, you just wait and do these big moments. I think there may be some reticence from an advertising perspective, because ultimately, who's really complicit is the major corporations that are benefiting from this, that are making most of the money. I mean, the mainstream media wants to cover China constantly. So if there's any negative story about a Chinese mine in Congo, they will cover it immediately. But they won't really cover the issue of conflict minerals. I mean, Apple saying they have no conflict minerals, I mean, it's a joke. It's a complete and total joke. And it's well known that that they've created all these organizations that literally monitor what's going on, that allow them to get away from it. So you start talking about that, you're talking about basically every major corporation on the planet, in the US and Europe, that you're taking on all at once. And in a sort of advertising-based business, I'd have to think that plays at least some role. I don't know if it's a controlling role. Now, that being said, in the Francophone world, Congo is very heavily covered. And that is because, well, one, it's a French-speaking country, but because in France, in Belgium, the sort of the colonial heritage, you have a lot of the diaspora that lives in these countries, and you have even a lot of the population who's more aware of what's going on there. So in the French language media, you actually get a lot of coverage of Congo, but I think in the English language media, it's seen as a non-story. It's seen as just more Africans fighting. It's only good for an occasional story. It's too complex for anyone to even care about it. And on top of that, if we really get deep into the story, we're going to be getting into an element of our own elites who we need to pay us to put out this news that maybe is not worth it. So when you put all that together, better to just cover it in flashes here and there rather than get really into it. But one thing I will say is there are a ton of journalists in Congo, almost all working in French. But if you're willing to sort of use all the translation tools that are out there, you really can follow people on the ground pretty easily on social media and all across the internet. So I want to shout out all the Congolese journalists who are working in the war zone and everywhere else doing great work, because they really are there. And a lot of them working freelance, independent, struggling to make it, but great work.
Yeah, absolutely. Where would we be without those frontline journalists? And as you were talking, I was thinking, I feel like part of it too is this aspect of green imperialism. You know, like the corporate media would want to show like, oh, look, like we have all this green energy, and we have all the, you know, for lithium batteries or whatever. And then the imperialist side of that is so dark and despicable. How do you square that circle? Well, you just don't talk about it.
No, it's huge. And it's a big conversation in Congo because, you know, Congo has tens of millions of hectares of arable land that's totally unused. I mean, I've seen 70 million, 80 million, 100 million. Like it could really be almost one of the breadbaskets of the world in terms of what's there. And there's a conversation in Congo about whether or not they should be focused more on food sovereignty and agriculture and moving away from mining, because the impacts of it are so negative. And when we talk about all these different pieces, I mean, the idea that you're going to replace every gas combustible car with an electric vehicle is absurd. There's not even enough lithium and cobalt to even do that. So there's a question of whether or not to lean into this new green economy, because it's dangerous for the people there, and it may be a false dawn in terms of what's possible. Because as we know, you need more public transportation and less cars. You know, we need different things like that, and we need to be talking about how that plays into ethical mining. So this is something that has been discussed in the past couple elections in Congo. It's definitely a big piece on the ground. Like, how do we actually square that circle of, if we want to save the planet, which we must desperately do, it's not a zero-sum game. And we could probably reduce the need for a lot of these minerals and also increase the human rights, for lack of a better word, around those who are working in these areas, who that's what they really want, in a way that's more just and more sustainable. But again, yeah, you'd have to talk about things that people don't want to talk about in terms of the agenda that's being pushed around a particular vision of climate change, which I think is important. And President Tshisekedi, whatever his faults, he made this point very well when they were putting up some blocks of the Congo forest for natural gas. And he said, listen, this is obviously bad for the environment. We know it's bad for the environment, but we're completely impoverished. And so unless you're going to give us money to help us lift up our own people, what else are we supposed to do? And it really raised the point of climate finance super sharply, and how the global north, if we really want to be serious about this, we have to invest in the global south and help them find ways to lift up their own people and not find ways, they have ways, but empower them to put forward their own solutions, so that they don't feel forced to be, you know, making any deal possible for some mine or some gas thing, just so people can have an opportunity to get, you know, some well water in their village.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we love to point the finger at small nations that basically their greenhouse gas emissions equal, like, you know, one platoon of the US military, but it's their fault, you know, because they don't know any better. And I wanted to, because you've mentioned a couple of times elections and you mentioned grassroots, I want to get to that before we wrap up here, because you had also shared, and I saw this, that there were some folks, there were some miners that were demonstrating in the mining capital, so-called of Kolwezi, and basically calling for like a co-op, basically the miners to own their own means of production. And I'm curious, what is the status of these kind of movements, particularly with the fact that massacres have happened for people just peacefully protesting. And with that, what are the chances of us seeing someone like a Patrice Lumumba come to power in Congo?
Well, I think the movements of miners, especially, but also farmers in the cooperative space, it's nascent but growing. But this is actually becoming a bigger trend across Africa because, the artisanal mining, it's to even be able to bring in more mining technology, all these different things, you really have to band together. And so I think what we're seeing in DRC is, and what you saw in that protest, it's nascent, but we're seeing more and more of that. We're seeing some of that around the gold industry as well. There's in a way, sort of like a proof of concept in Zimbabwe, where they actually set up a Zimbabwe Miners Federation, where like thousands of mainly gold miners, but some others have sort of banded together in a co-op. So if you want to come buy gold, you go to the co-op, and then they basically then interface with the miners. They gather up the amount of gold you need, and then they sell it to you, and then they redistribute the proceeds amongst themselves. So it allows you not only to band together to control pricing, but also to give yourself the means to improve the situation that you are in by bringing in more safety technology, by being able to build things in your various different mining fields, bringing in more advanced technology. Burkina Faso has been having a conversation between the government and artisanal miners around this. So I think what we're seeing in DRC is very much in the vein of what we're seeing everywhere. But like you said, it's difficult. I mean, you have these massacres, and you have so many interests that do not necessarily want to see this, but because of the popular pressure, you're seeing more of this happening. So like there's a gold deal between DRC and UAE that at least allegedly is supposed to also facilitate the growth of some cooperatives in that sector. So, we shall see, but I definitely think the tide of popular resistance is rising. It's just very challenging. But the fact that there's more eyes on Congo is also helping, because it's created this sort of conspiracy of silence around the suppression of these movements. Even though it's not anywhere where we need it to be, it's been broken at least a little bit. It's cracking at least a little bit, and people are knowing these different actions are happening. And in terms of the future, I think it's possible. I mean, the Congolese political scene is all controlled by elites like almost everywhere else in the world, right? But on the same token, if you look at the discourse of the elites in the last election of all the different political parties, they're all saying the same thing. And they're all kind of, in some ways, speaking to this. We need more development. We need roads. We need hospitals. We need schools. This is partially why, by the way, Congo is working so closely with China, because a lot of these mining deals come with hospitals, they come with roads, they come with railways, they come with other types of infrastructure that people really need and want to see. So even the elites who I think don't want to make big pushes on this, I mean, Tshisekedi has made a bigger push than his predecessor, Kabila. But, they have to speak to some degree to these popular aspirations. And that to me says that the sort of subterranean fire that's happening amongst the average Congolese is scaring the elites to such a degree that they at least have to pretend that they want to move in that direction. And that to me means that you really can open up the possibility for new political forces to emerge. And I think the legacy of Lumumba is very strong, very well known. The young people especially are talking about Lumumba. They're talking about Sankara. They're talking about the history, just like all over the African continent. So I think as bleak as it can seem, big change often happens sadly in very chaotic moments. And I think the people of Congo are interjecting themselves more and more into the political conversation in a way that's harder and harder for the elite forces to ignore. But of course, that means that we're going to see more and more, especially coming from the West, to try to prevent that from taking place.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for all of that, Eugene. I really, really appreciate you contextualizing this important issue. I know you mentioned the frontline journalists. Where are some other places where people can follow this issue, and also, of course, your work?
Well, you can definitely follow us at Breakthrough News on all your social media at BT Newsroom. We're trying to follow Congo as closely as we possibly can. You can find me at Eugene Puryear. I'm trying to follow it as closely as you can. There's a lot of local media, like I said, that's sort of out there. It's all in French, so if I try to pronounce it, it's terrible. But if you go to my Twitter at Eugene Puryear and just search Congo, search DRC, you'll see I'm quote tweeting and linking to a lot of these on the ground journalists and a lot of the local media in terms of my own work. And that can kind of take you down a little bit of a rabbit hole to some of the radio stations, TV stations, websites, and others, and also the journalists themselves who are working, super hard to get this information out on Congo.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eugene. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me.